The soft chime of the store's entrance bell barely registered over the murmur of shoppers and the crisp scent of polished leather. Inside Regal Footwear, an upscale shoe boutique known for its handcrafted Italian leather, wealthy patrons browsed under the warm glow of elegant chandeliers. Ethan Reynolds, a self-made millionaire, stood near the checkout counter, his sharp navy suit tailored to perfection, his gold watch gleaming under the store lights. He wasn't here because he needed new shoes. He had more than he could count. He was here out of boredom, killing time between meetings. That was when he saw him. Near the back of the store, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes stood hesitantly in front of a display of pristine dress shoes. His frame, lean but upright, suggested resilience despite his fraying jacket and rough hands. But it wasn't his posture or even his faded clothing that caught attention. It was his shoes. They were a patchwork of wear and tear, the fabric so tattered that his socks peeked through holes at the toes. The soles were uneven, peeling away at the edges, barely held together by strips of tape. They weren't just old, they looked like they had walked 1,000 miles past their lifespan. Ethan let out a chuckle, loud enough for the people around him to hear. "Are those antiques?" he said, smirking as he motioned toward the shoes. His voice, rich with arrogance, carried across the store. "Or are you starting a new fashion trend?" A few quiet giggles followed. A well-dressed woman nearby glanced at the older man and quickly looked away, as if embarrassed for him. A sales associate hesitated, unsure whether to step in. The older man, Daniel Carter, simply turned his head toward Ethan. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't retaliate with anger. Instead, he did something that no one expected. He smiled. Not a forced smile, nor one laced with bitterness, but a genuine, knowing smile, as if he had seen men like Ethan before. As if he had heard laughter like this in another lifetime and already knew how the story would play out. Then, with calm precision, he bent down, untied his battered shoes, and slipped them off. He placed them neatly on the polished tile floor, standing barefoot as he straightened back up. The store went silent. Ethan scoffed, tilting his head. "What, are you donating them to the museum?" Daniel chuckled softly, then lifted his gaze to meet Ethan's directly. There was something in his eyes, not anger, not shame, but something deeper. "Son," he said, his voice steady but warm, "these shoes have taken me further than you could ever imagine." The words hung in the air, drawing attention from passers-by who hadn't been paying attention before. A young store employee who had been stacking boxes nearby paused, his curiosity piqued. A mother shopping with her child stopped mid-browse, drawn to the conversation. Ethan folded his arms, clearly entertained. "Oh yeah? Where exactly have those fine pieces of craftsmanship taken you?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply gestured toward his worn-out shoes on the floor. Then he said, "Let me tell you a story." And just like that, everyone in the store leaned in to listen, even the ones who had laughed just moments before. Daniel Carter stood barefoot on the cold tile floor of the luxury shoe boutique, his worn-out shoes resting neatly beside him. A hush had fallen over the store. Even those who hadn't been paying attention before were now watching, waiting. Ethan Reynolds, the wealthy businessman who had laughed at him, crossed his arms, smirking. "All right, old man, let's hear it. What's so special about those rags you call shoes?" Daniel exhaled slowly, then picked up one of his battered shoes, turning it in his hands as if it were something precious. "These shoes," he began, his voice steady, "have walked through more than you could ever imagine. They've taken me through the halls of a school where I once taught children who had been told they'd never amount to anything. They carried me home to a loving wife whose laughter filled every room, even when our pockets were empty. They stood firm when I held her hand through a long battle with illness, one that took everything I had to fight alongside her." The murmurs in the store quieted further. Ethan's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it. "So what happened? Why didn't you just get new shoes?" Daniel chuckled, but there was sadness behind it. "Because life has a way of teaching you what really matters. You see, when my wife fell sick, I spent every last dollar trying to save her. Medical bills, treatments, specialists, things a man like you probably never has to think twice about. I didn't buy myself new shoes because at the time, the only thing that mattered was making sure she had everything she needed." A few customers exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably. The luxury store, once filled with the scent of polished leather and quiet conversation, now felt like a courtroom of conscience. Ethan, though, shrugged. Sounds like bad financial planning to me. You should have saved more. Daniel didn't react. He simply set his shoe back down and looked Ethan straight in the eyes. Tell me something, son. How much are your shoes worth? Ethan glanced at his own handcrafted Italian leather shoes, their rich brown sheen catching the light. He smirked. About $2,000. Why? Daniel nodded thoughtfully. And what have they done for you? Ethan blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? They're shoes. They get me where I need to go. Daniel smiled. Exactly. He gestured at Ethan's expensive footwear. But what's the furthest they've really taken you? Have they walked you into a hospital room where you stayed up all night, holding the hand of someone you love? Have they carried you to the doorstep of a child who thought they'd never have a mentor, only for you to show up, day after day, proving them wrong? Have they ever taken you somewhere where the only thing that mattered wasn't how you looked, but who you were? Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched. And then something unexpected happened. A young employee, maybe in his early 20s, stepped forward from behind the checkout counter. His store uniform was crisp but plain, and his sneakers were cheap and slightly scuffed. He cleared his throat, his voice hesitant but sincere. Sir, he addressed Daniel, if you don't mind me asking, what did you do after your wife? Daniel's gaze softened. After she passed, I did what I knew best. I kept walking, I kept teaching. Not in a school, not officially, but wherever I could. I mentored kids who didn't have anyone. I worked odd jobs to survive, but I never stopped sharing what I had, even if all I had left was wisdom and time. The young man nodded slowly, his admiration clear. Ethan shifted, clearly uncomfortable. He ran a hand over his face, then scoffed. So what, you're saying being poor is noble? Daniel shook his head. Not at all. I'm saying that wealth isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by what you do with what you have. A woman near the back of the store murmured, That's the truth. Ethan let out a forced chuckle, but it lacked the confidence from earlier. He rubbed the back of his neck, then sighed, glancing at the floor where Daniel's tattered shoes still lay. Then, in a move no one expected, Ethan slipped off his expensive shoes. The entire store gasped. He set them down carefully in front of Daniel. Here, Ethan said, his voice quieter now. Take them. A man like you deserves a decent pair of shoes. Daniel smiled, a small, knowing smile. But instead of reaching for the shoes, he turned to the young employee. Son, he said, addressing the young man who had spoken earlier, what's your biggest dream? The employee hesitated. I want to start my own business one day, but I don't have the money. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his pocket. From within, he pulled out a watch, an old scratched timepiece, simple but well kept. He turned it over in his hand before offering it to the young man. This watch was a gift from my wife, Daniel said. It reminds me that time is the greatest currency. If you value it, you'll never be poor. The young man took the watch with shaking hands, his eyes shining with emotion. And then, without hesitation, Daniel picked up the expensive shoes Ethan had offered him and handed them to the young man. Gasps echoed through the store again. Wear these, Daniel said, not because they're expensive, but because they're proof that generosity isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. The young man nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The store was silent, filled with a new kind of energy, a reverence, a shift, an awakening. Ethan stood frozen, watching as the young employee held his expensive shoes, still reeling from the unexpected gift. And then, without a word, Ethan reached into his wallet, pulled out a thick stack of cash, and handed it to Daniel. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. I don't need your money, son. Ethan hesitated. Then what do you need? Daniel's eyes twinkled with something unreadable. For you to walk in those shoes of yours with purpose, that's all. Ethan swallowed hard, then nodded. And as the store watched, something changed in the air, something unspoken, but deeply understood by everyone in the room. It was no longer about money or status or appearances. It was about the journey. The store, once filled with polished shoes and shallow conversations, now held a lesson that no price tag could ever match. And what happened next would leave everyone in that store talking for years to come. The silence in Regal footwear was almost deafening. It was as if everyone in the store had just witnessed something they couldn't quite put into words. The weight of the moment, an ordinary interaction turned into a lesson on humility, wealth, and purpose, hung thick in the air. Daniel Carter, the man in tattered shoes, stood barefoot, his quiet wisdom lingering in the minds of every onlooker. He hadn't accepted Ethan's expensive shoes. He had given them away instead. And in doing so, he had left behind something far more valuable than luxury footwear. He had left behind a new way of thinking. Ethan Reynolds, the wealthy businessman who had started the encounter with arrogance and laughter, now stood motionless. His mind was racing, but for the first time in years, it wasn't about profit margins, investments, or luxury. It was about something deeper. He cleared his throat, glancing at Daniel. You really don't want the money? His voice lacked its earlier bravado. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was genuine confusion. Daniel shook his head with a patient smile. Money isn't the problem, son. It never was. It's how we use it that defines us. He glanced at the young store employee who was still staring at the expensive shoes in his hands as if they carried a great responsibility. That young man? He needed them more, and you needed to see what giving feels like. Ethan had spent his entire life believing wealth was the goal. He had chased it relentlessly, built his empire from nothing, and prided himself on his success. But now, standing barefoot in an expensive store, staring at a man who had lost everything and still refused to take what was freely offered, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of lacking. Not in money, but in something else. In meaning. The young store employee, eyes still glossy with emotion, finally spoke up. I don't know how to thank you, sir. His voice wavered, and he looked at Daniel like a student gazing at a teacher who had changed his life with one lesson. Daniel gave him a knowing nod. Just promise me one thing. When you get where you're going, don't forget to help the next person behind you. The young man swallowed hard and nodded. I will, I swear I will. The air around them had shifted. Customers who had once been bystanders now felt like participants. They had come to the store for luxury, but they were leaving with introspection. A middle-aged woman, clutching a designer purse, cleared her throat and stepped forward. I want to pay for that young man's first business license. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A father holding his daughter's hand spoke next. And I'll cover his first month's rent for whatever space he starts in. Another man nodded. I'll help too. The young employee was stunned. His hands shook as he looked at the growing crowd of strangers willing to invest in his dream. I don't know what to say. Daniel smiled. Say thank you, and when the time comes, do the same for someone else. Ethan stood still, watching it all unfold. He had spent years building his wealth, yet he had never seen people give so freely, without expecting anything in return. It was humbling, and a little unsettling. Because for the first time, he wondered, had he been rich in money, but poor in purpose all along? Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his checkbook, something he usually only used for business deals, not moments like this. He ripped out a check, signed it, and held it out to Daniel. This isn't for you, he clarified. It's for whatever cause you believe in. Daniel studied the check for a long moment before finally taking it. He didn't even look at the amount. Instead, he nodded once. You're learning. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. I think you just cost me a small fortune in therapy. Daniel laughed heartily. Life has a way of teaching us for free, son. Ethan ran a hand over his face, letting out another sigh. Tell me something, Daniel. His voice was different now, lighter but more serious. What's the one thing you've learned from all of this? Daniel paused, glancing at his old shoes still sitting on the floor. Then he answered. That no matter how worn out your shoes are, It's the path you walk that truly defines you. The simplicity of it hit Ethan harder than any business lesson he had ever learned. It wasn't about what you owned. It was about what you left behind. And Daniel Carter? He had left behind wisdom, a lesson, a legacy. The store gradually returned to its usual hum of business. Employees restocked shelves, customers browsed again. But the energy was different now. People whispered about what they had just witnessed. Strangers exchanged glances with newfound kindness. The world outside the store hadn't changed, but the people in it had. As Daniel bent down to slip back into his old shoes, Ethan stopped him. Wait. Daniel raised a brow as Ethan knelt down, grabbed his own socks, and slid them onto Daniel's feet before he could object. The store watched, stunned. Ethan grinned up at him. One step at a time, huh? Daniel shook his head, laughing softly. One step at a time. And with that, Ethan walked out of the store barefoot, for the first time in his life, feeling like he was truly walking the right path. Months later, a small business opened in the city. A modest storefront with handwritten signs in the window and a counter filled with possibility. It belonged to the young employee from Regal Footwear. Hanging on the wall behind the register was an old, scratched watch, next to a framed pair of tattered, worn-out shoes. And beneath them, a plaque that read, "Wealth isn't what you have, it's what you leave behind." The moment Ethan laughed at Daniel's shoes, he thought he was above him. By the end of the encounter, he realized he had been beneath him all along. The simple act of giving, of sharing, of seeing beyond wealth and status changed more than just Ethan. It changed everyone who witnessed it. And that's the thing about true wealth. It doesn't come from what you own. It comes from the footprints you leave behind.